Hello nerds, welcome back to my channel and to the third and final video in my little mini series all about political theory embedded within the Hunger Games. I can't believe that this is coming to an end. It has been so much fun. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about a question that has pervaded all 5 books: real or not real. And I'll be getting into all of the nitty-gritty details about propaganda, human reasoning, and implicit submission within Sunrise on the Reaping. The majority of this discussion will be done using David Hume's theories on human understanding and government, as well as the invention of the terms Snowspeak and doublethink invented by George Orwell in his novel 1984. We're going to talk about what exactly propaganda is, if it can be defined at all, who uses it, why it's used, and why it's so effective. My first video in this series was all about war theory and revolution within the OG Hunger Games trilogy, and my second video was all about the debate on human nature and different types of government within the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. If you haven't watched those yet, feel free to watch them, but you do not need to have watched them in order to enjoy this video. Quick housekeeping before I get into everything, just to say thank you so much for your patience. Making this video came with several technical difficulties and mental breakdowns. I'm gonna rant for a little bit, so skip this if you want, it's not really that important. I've been out of university for a year now, and apparently that means I no longer have access to any Microsoft applications or to my university's peer-reviewed library databases. I can no longer use Microsoft Word. I can't edit anything that I've already created. I can't even copy paste. Thankfully, I can open things and read them, but yeah, I can't do anything with things that I've already made, which is such a bummer. And my account was under my school email, so I don't even know if I can renew it with that email, and even if I can, it's really freaking expensive. So I've been using Google Docs, and I hate Google Docs. As for the databases, I lost like full access to JSTOR, EBSCOhost, Scholars Portal, like all of those things. I did figure out how to gain alumni access, but it is extremely limited to what I used to have. And it's just been very frustrating because I used all of these things regularly before I lost access, and I was under the impression that I would have access to these things for 3 years after I graduated, so it was quite a rude awakening. All this to say, I did not have the same level of resources to make this video as I did for making the other 2 videos. I still tried my best to find decent scholarly articles to work off of, but if the content of this video does not feel up to par with the other 2, this is the reason why, and I hope that my passion for this book series and these topics makes up for anything that is lacking. Okay, let's dive right in. At the end of Ballad, we get this conversation between Dr. Gall and Corio, and Gall tells him that she has erased all footage of the 10th Hunger Games, of course, except for the one copy that is in her master vault. And it's all been erased because it presented the Capitol as far too vulnerable and incompetent. Of course, this begs the question, what is the extent and use of Capitol propaganda? How far does it go in maintaining its narrative that it is the victim of the dark days and that it is superior to the districts? This is where Sunrise on the Reaping comes in to give us a better look at the inner political workings of the Capitol. I do have some fun questions to ask per usual, but it's probably best if we start with a little bit of definition. So first, let's start with defining propaganda. Martin, 1971, defined it as a persuasive form of communication with a specific source, purpose, and target. That's a very broad definition and doesn't really give us a concrete answer as to what propaganda is. So how about we do this instead? Let's do a little classroom activity. When I say the word propaganda, what comes to mind? Perhaps you think of capitalist versus communist political cartoons during the Cold War, or the use of fear-mongering during the War on Terrorism, which I'm definitely going to be talking about later on. Maybe your mind goes to the Make America Great Again slogan, or to Israel's demonization of Palestinians and their Zionist greenwashing slogan, Making the Desert Bloom. What do all of these examples have in common? Truth versus lies, misinformation, political and or ideological competition, us versus them, good versus evil. Horrors 2021 explained that although the content and effectiveness of propaganda varies, its creation usually depends on 3 key things: repression, crisis, and diversion. You can pinpoint each of these 3 things in the examples that I just gave, but let's do it with the Hunger Games, since that's what this video is all about. Repression. This is the use of force or violence to control a population. That's easy. Capital repression and oppression of the districts. Crisis. An extremely difficult or dangerous situation. The capital justifies its every action based on the biggest crisis Panem had ever experienced, the Dark Days. And finally, diversion, an action that takes attention away from something, especially one that gives pleasure or enjoyment. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, gender non-conforming people, welcome to the Hunger Games, the biggest sporting event of the year. Silverstein, 1987, explained that propaganda is difficult to recognize because it's omnipresent and based on ideals and values that tend to already exist at large within a society. And it's often very subtle. Some examples of subtle propaganda can include the censorship of print journalism, and this doesn't necessarily mean refusal to print a story. It can also mean the removal of certain words by editors, the removal of advertisements for smaller prints, which can lead to them going out of business, and the removal of journalists from certain assignments. Not all of these things are done with the intent to necessarily manipulate an audience, but nonetheless, they can be examples of propaganda. A second example is abstraction. This is when an antagonist is manufactured by state leaders who talk about hypothetical attacks on domestic soil. And a third example is the misuse of language, which I'm going to talk about at length in my section on fear and doublespeak, or what I call snowspeak. Okay, let's define implicit submission next. To communicate in an implicit manner means to communicate without outwardly expressing yourself through words. You agree to do something via your actions rather than your words. You agree without actually saying, I agree. Submission is a bending to the authority and control of another. You submit to the government in your country of residence because you abide by its laws. Put these two things together and you get implicit submission, which essentially means that you consent and submit to your country's government, even though you may have never said, I consent to this government and I will abide by its laws. And even if you hate your government and think all of its laws are absurd, if you continue to live there and to abide by these laws, then you are implicitly submitting. It's important to note that a country or a society cannot function unless the vast majority of its citizens do implicitly submit to its rule. With these definitions in mind, here are some questions that I think are worth considering. By the way, I absolutely love that y'all try to answer these questions, and some of the answers have just been incredible and have gotten me to think about things in new ways, and I absolutely love that, so thank you. Genuinely makes me so happy. Okay, here are the questions. Number one, and this comes right from Suzanne Collins herself, how much propaganda does it take to make you think that implicit submission is what you want? Number two, democratic countries often pride themselves on being free, but do citizens of a democracy actually have intellectual and political freedom? Number three, who is most affected by propaganda and what can be done to protect oneself against it? Number four, is propaganda always bad? And if it's not, how can we differentiate between good propaganda and bad propaganda? Okay, now let's get into the analysis, and I'd like to start with propaganda itself. In the Q&A interview between Suzanne Collins and her editor, David Levithan, which I've linked in the description below, Levithan says something really interesting. He says that Hamish is a reliable narrator surrounded by many unreliable narrators. And it's really interesting to think about propaganda in this way. An unreliable narrator is one who has a skewed version of reality, whether that's intentional or not, doesn't matter. Their point of view is misleading and it cannot be trusted. The reader might not even realize that they are being misled, just like how at 13 years old, I didn't realize that PETA is actually the sweetest boy ever and not someone who would turn into a raging beast tribute. Yeah, I really fell for it, and so did Katniss. And the same can be said for propaganda. You might not even realize that it is being fed to you, that someone is trying to manipulate and mislead you into believing something that isn't necessarily true, and whether it's a half-truth, an exaggeration of the truth, or a flat-out lie doesn't matter. The point is that you're not getting an accurate picture of reality. When establishing a government, there are many key things to be considered. A head of state must know how to control and rule over their populace, and some might do this through dignity and respect, but others will do it through propaganda. But why choose propaganda? We can look to David Hume's essays number 4 and 5 in his text Essays, Moral, Political, and Literary to answer this question. And these essays are titled On the First Principles of Government, that's number 4, and number 5 is Of the Origin of Government. And essay 4 begins with the quote that is found on the very first page of Sunrise. Nothing appears more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophical eye than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is effected, we shall find that, as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular. The first half of the quote describes implicit submission, and we'll get to that later, but for now I want to focus on the second half of the quote. The citizens of a state have the force. They have the power, and that is because they outnumber their rulers. Let's say your country has a population of 40 million, but only one ruler. Who has the power? Who has the force? That is the 39.99999 million people. And that leaves the head of state with opinion, and opinion only. So in order to maintain control, they must maintain a popular opinion of themselves and their policy. And opinion is relevant in all kinds of states, whether it's a military, authoritarian, populist, or democratic state, it doesn't matter. Opinion is always relevant. If the citizen's opinion on the head of state shifts from good to bad, well, that ruler is basically screwed. They won't be able to maintain power for much longer. And I'm going to give you a real life example. So I'm Canadian and we just had a federal election, April 2025. Back in early January, our former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigned from his position. A lot of people didn't like him and a lot of people were fed up with the Liberal Party of Canada. So the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, was projected to become our next leader. Then late January, after Donald Trump was inaugurated as President of the United States of America, he started making some serious tariff threats against Canada and started saying that we would become the 51st state. A lot of Canadians were very unhappy with this, obviously, and because Poilievre had previously aligned himself with Trump, public opinion on him started to change and change fast. In March, Mark Carney replaced Trudeau as the leader of the Liberal Party, and in just 1 month, he won over so many people that he was elected as Prime Minister. We went from potentially having a sweeping Conservative win to having the Liberals re-elected. That was a very simplified version of events, but hopefully you get the idea. Public opinion matters. Now, let's say hypothetically that Poilievre was elected before Trump started making these threats. How do you control public opinion when you know it won't be in your favor much longer? Poilievre might have relied on propaganda. He had been relying really heavily on common sense politics, and that was kind of the basis for his party's platform. So we might have seen him play into that a lot more, doing whatever it would take to shift opinion back to good. People often joke that politicians are liars because they just say what they know people want to hear, and to some extent that is true. We see something similar happen in Ballad, where public opinion on the Hunger Games shifts from bad to good because of Gall and Snow's propaganda. It worked, and it worked well, and the games would not have lasted for another 65 years if opinion had not shifted. Now, let's shift back to Hume's theory on opinion. He said that there are two kinds, opinion of interest and opinion of right. I'm not really going to focus on opinion of interest because it's when the government in charge is equally as advantageous as any other option. And this isn't really relevant to the circumstances in the Hunger Games because Snow's government was really the only option available until Paler's democracy came into play, but by then Snow was dead. Even then, they weren't equally advantageous. So what about opinion of right? It can be broken down into two parts. First is the right to power, which can be understood by observing the attachment all nations have to their ancient government. People tend to have a strong attachment to history and antiquity. So if your government is based on this attachment, then it will have stronger political legitimacy. Additionally, the longer a government has existed, the more it seems to have a right to exist, literally just because it's old. Panem is an allegory for the United States, and the United States has attached itself to Greek and Roman antiquity, but more specifically the Roman Empire. There's a lot of Roman influence in US architecture and symbolism, for example, sporting stadiums looking like the Colosseum, and the use of the eagle as a symbol for victory and power. Collins implemented this idea really well throughout the series. The eagle is the family symbol of the Heavensbees, the wealthiest, or one of the wealthiest families in all of Panem. The games reflect violent single-victor gladiator culture. Most notably, though, Capital and District 2 citizens are almost always named after Roman historical figures. This is not a coincidence or an accident. They are named this way on purpose. It's a way to remind people that the capital is powerful, just like the Roman Empire. And then there's the right to property. And I love Hume here because he throws a lot of shade on John Locke. And it's just so freaking funny when political theorists diss each other. Like, some people love rap diss tracks. I love theory diss tracks. Locke made the ownership of property the foundation for government, and Hume said that Locke took his property theory too far, although he did acknowledge that property does have influence on the matters of government. According to Hume, it is on opinion of interest and on opinion of right that all governments are founded, and where authority of the few over the many occurs. Snow maintained opinion of interest by assassinating political threats, making his government the only one with any advantage. Right to power was maintained through Roman symbolism, and the right to property was maintained through capitalism. The capital owned all means of production and profited off of production in the districts by exploiting their labor and resources. Hume also said that there are 3 secondary influences to the foundation of government, and a government has to have all 3 of these things. They will seem good in theory, but as President Snow shows us, they can very much be corrupted. So the first is self-interest. A population has the expectation that a reward will be given to them by their government. It is within human nature to seek great favors, and so a ruler's authority will be more legitimate if the population has the prospect of receiving a reward. Now, it's unclear how President Snow rewards the citizens of the capital, but we do see how he rewards the districts for participating in the games. You come out as a victor, and your reward is that you get to live in a really fancy house with heating and AC, and you won't starve to death. Yay! For the careers and District 2 in particular, their loyalty is less wavering because there's so much emphasis placed on this reward within their culture. The more their tributes win the games, the more loyal they'll be to the capital. Second is fear. It is important that your population be afraid to break the law. It's important that people be afraid to do things like murder other people. Snow is a fearmonger, though. Disobey me, Beatty, and I put Ambert into the games. Disobey me, Katniss, and I'll kill everyone you love. Disobey me, Pollux, and I'll cut out your tongue. Disobey me, Haymitch, and I'll ensure that you die really slowly and really painfully in the arena. Snow says to Haymitch, there are many different ways to die in the arena. You might get stabbed or strangled or die of thirst. Death by mutts tends to be the most memorable. We have some beauties this year, programmable to serve individual tributes, and far scarier than the weasels. Snow focused on the mutts in this conversation with Haymitch because he had listened to the mentor conversation between him and Mags, where Mags was asking, what are you most afraid of, or what is your one wish in the arena? However, ruling on fear alone is not enough. You need to also have affection, and that is the third thing. There should be a balance between fear and affection. To be loved by their population, a ruler must have a public role that serves the people's interests. Snow wants to be perceived as the #1 peacekeeper because it means he'll be more loved by capital citizens. He infuses them with fear, and then he says, don't worry, I'll protect you, I will serve you. All of this from Snow is just lies and propaganda. Of course, there aren't actually rewards for the victors. In fact, there are no victors, there are only survivors. Yes, they're given a decent place to live, but this small reward is outweighed by all of the things that they are put through afterwards, like Haymitch being forced to mentor his peers, Finnick and Kashmir being forced into child prostitution, and Mags, Wyrus, and Peta being tortured to the point of physical and mental disability. For fear, yes, Snow often did follow through on his threats, but other times it was a lie or an exaggeration. He didn't kill Haymitch slowly and painfully in the arena, but he did ensure that Haymitch would live a long life where he has to mentor all of these kids, and every year he has to relive his trauma and pain. As for affection, even if Snow says, "I love you, I'll serve you," there is no love in a ruler who kills children and mutilates people who break the law. Returning to public opinion and its precariousness, there are several examples throughout Sunrise where Snow tries to manipulate opinion with propaganda and or where characters start to see through this manipulation. For the most part, I'd say public opinion of the capital is very negative within the districts that aren't career. For example, when we're first introduced to Lenore Dove as a character, she's singing a song, and I love all the Covey songs because they do such a good job at explaining different concepts within the books. Let's see if I can memorize this off the top of my head. I am not looking at my notes. They hang the man and flog the woman who steals the goose from off the common, yet let the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Yes, I did. So, a common is a parcel of land that is to be used by everyone. It is clear that Lenore Dove is aware of the economic circumstances of Panem. She's aware that what should be communal land is being exploited by the capital. Lenore Dove and her geese were also often chased off the meadow by peacekeepers for quite literally no reason, but the problem runs even deeper than that. In District 12, the capital flogs and hangs people who poach, and yet these are people who are poaching because otherwise they will starve. And the capital is very comfortable stealing what is produced in District 12, their coal. The coal should be a part of the common, but the capital takes and never gives back. Maisley is another character who is firm in her negative opinion of the capital, and she understands that to bring them down, public opinion must change. She refuses to accept the idea that district children are animalistic and barbaric, and she wants to show that they are just as civilized, just as human, and she does this by placing so much emphasis on her manners. She always eats using utensils and folding a napkin and creating party spreads for her and Haymitch to eat from in the arena. I have a silly little headcanon that what pissed Snow off the most about Maisley was not that she killed a game maker, but that when she was in the arena, she had folded a handkerchief into a beautiful napkin to use while eating. Now, the reason for this is because in Ballad, Corio says that he thinks he is more civilized than the districts because he always carries a clean hanky with him. And so I just know that this really set him off. I just know that he had felt like he'd been shown up by Maisley. Haymitch too wants to change public opinion. When Mags, of course, asked the tributes what they wanted, Haymitch first said that he didn't want his loved ones to watch him die a slow and horrible death. But then he thought about it a little more and he amended his answer. I want to make the capital own what they're doing to us. I want to remind people that I'm here because the capital won the war and thinks that 50 years later, this is a fair way to punish the districts. But I'd like them to consider that 50 years is enough. And although Haymitch largely fails at this for a very long time, there are other characters who help him out. Like Lulu, for example, who denounces the capital during her public interview, and it's no wonder that the capital drugs her into unconsciousness with whatever drug contraption is attached to her chest. She singled out the front row ticket holders by saying, "You'll murder us." She was holding them accountable, and there is so much power in that. Unfortunately, public opinion doesn't start to shift in all of the districts until Katniss convinces them all to join the revolution. But it takes work to get to that point, and Haymitch, Maisley, Lulu, and Lenore Dove were all a part of that. They did things that were witnessed by at least one other person, and this caused ripples in the lake called status quo. Lenore Dove's spray-painted counter-propaganda was witnessed by Maisley. Maisley's perfect manners were witnessed by the District 12's prep team. Haymitch running away with Luella's body was witnessed by everyone at the opening ceremony, and Lulu's criticisms were witnessed by every single person in that live interview audience. So that covers public opinion, and I'd now like to talk about the relationship between fear-mongering and doublespeak. Fear-mongering is propaganda because it's an exaggeration of a danger that doesn't necessarily exist to begin with. Lynch 2006 described doublespeak as language that pretends to communicate but doesn't. It makes the good seem bad or the bad seem good. It deliberately uses euphemisms, half-truths, and ambiguous words. Doublespeak comes from two words coined by George Orwell in his novel 1984, Newspeak and doublethink. 1984 is a dystopian novel about propaganda within an authoritarian government, and this government is ruled by an omniscient, semi-divine, and all-powerful man known as Big Brother. No one knows him, no one sees him, but he is always watching. The Big Brother government enlists several members of its party to create a new language called Newspeak, but it isn't exactly a creation, it's more of a destruction. We learn from a character named Syme, who is working on the latest dictionary for Newspeak, that what they're doing is getting the language into its final shape, the shape it's going to have when nobody speaks anything else. When we've finished with it, people like you will have to learn it all over again. You think, I dare say, that our chief job is inventing new words, but not a bit of it. We're destroying words, scores of them, hundreds of them, every day. We're cutting the language down to the bone. So an example of this Newspeak can be seen in the different ministries within Oceania, the place where this book is taking place. One of those is the Ministry of Peace. That is what it's called in English, but in Newspeak it's called Mini-Pax. Fun fact, Pax is the name of the Roman goddess of peace. So again, there's that connection to the attachment that states have to their predecessors, their ancient governments. The main goal of Newspeak is to narrow down people's range of thought by rubbing out the meaning of words so that people can no longer commit thought crime. Thought crime is essentially any action or thought that does not align with Big Brother's ideology. The Ministry of Peace paradoxically concerns itself with warfare. This is a perfect segue into explaining doublethink, because the Ministry of Peace, in saying one thing but doing another, is an example of doublethink. To doublethink is to hold two contradictory opinions simultaneously. It's to know and to not know. It's to be aware of the truth while also telling and believing carefully constructed lies. It's to be conscious and unconscious. Doublethink is cognitive dissonance, and there is a lot of that happening in the minds of capital citizens. So Newspeak is the destruction of language, or as Big Brother puts it, ignorance is strength, and doublethink is cognitive dissonance. And that brings us back to the combination of these two things, doublespeak. In Sunrise, the slogans used by Snow are no peace, no security, no peacekeepers, no peace, no capital, no peace. All of these slogans are contradictory. There is no peace in Panem because there is an exorbitant amount of security. There is no peace in Panem because peacekeepers are actually war keepers. At the reaping, Drusilla yells, "Shut up or we'll kill everybody," something like that, as a peacekeeper sprays a fire of bullets and a hovercraft flies over the square. There is no peace in Panem so long as the capital continues with the Hunger Games. These slogans, by forcing people to be cognitively dissonant, make the population ignorant. These slogans communicate without actually saying anything. And I love Lenore Dove because she totally called the capital out on their doublespeak by spray painting counter slogans: no capital, no hanging tree, no capital, no reaping. There are a couple other instances of blatant doublespeak within this book. All of the posters that read Panem's #1 peacekeeper with a photo of President Snow are doublespeak, or what I'm calling Snowspeak. This slogan has two opposing meanings. The first meaning is exactly what it says. Snow is Panem's #1 peacekeeper by virtue of being the president. But the second meaning is that Snow is Panem's #1 war keeper. He doesn't keep the peace, he maintains eternal war. Because this slogan is contradictory, it's not actually saying anything. The two meanings basically cancel each other out, and this slogan loses all genuine meaning because when the people of Panem read it, they have to engage in doublethink. They have to be ignorant. But ignorance is exactly what President Snow wants from his subjects, because an ignorant subject is one that is easier to control. An ignorant subject is one that will continue to fall for nonsensical propaganda. I'm talking a lot about these citizens being very ignorant, but they might not actually be as mindless as we think. Remember, propaganda is a tool of persuasion as well as one of control. It can be used to persuade someone into believing a thing that they don't necessarily believe to begin with. The slogans I mentioned earlier were ones that are geared towards the districts, but there are also ones that are geared towards capital citizens. No peace, no prosperity, no Hunger Games, no peace. It's the same campaign they used on our square back in District 12, but with slogans geared to the capital residents. Seems the capital has to convince its own citizens too. Another example of Snowspeak is in the first few paragraphs of Chapter 1. I roll straight off the mattress onto the floor and pull on a pair of shorts made from a government-issued flour sack. The words, courtesy of the capital, end up stamped across my butt. A courtesy implies that something has been done or given generously. It's like the capital is saying, look, District 12, we are being so generous by giving you flour. But giving rations of flour to people that you're simultaneously starving is not a courtesy. Not to mention that the flour isn't even good quality because what it makes is gritty, dark stuff. Haymitch's underwear is also made from flour sacks. Anyone who has to resort to wearing flour sack underwear is not being treated with generosity. Haymitch also tells us that a tessera gets you a ration of tinned oil and a sack of flour marked courtesy of the capital for one person collectible each month at the Justice Building. Having to enter your name extra times into the reaping bowl for a sadistic game in exchange for a minute amount of food and oil is not a courtesy. Even Justice Building is an example of doublespeak. Woodbine was killed from snipers who were on top of the roof of the Justice Building. There is no justice for District 12. This is Snowspeak at its finest. Every Hunger Games book can be connected to past or current events, but when I read these books, I can't help but see all the things that the United States did post 9/11, and I'd like to talk about that quickly because it's really relevant to the discussion of doublespeak, since the Bush administration was employing that kind of language a lot at the time. I actually got the idea for the term Snowspeak from an article titled "Bush Speak and the Politics of Lying, Presidential Rhetoric in the War on Terror" by Kellner, 2007. The Bush-Cheney administration used a rhetoric of war on terrorism and made a spectacle of the US invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq to combat Al-Qaeda and the 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, a symbol for global capitalism, and on the Pentagon, a symbol for US military power. Bush's rhetoric declared war against evil, against the bloodthirsty, and called for the extermination of all Muslims. As you might imagine, there were a lot of propaganda slogans being used: war on America, attack on America, America under attack, a doctrine for a preventative war, Operation Infinite Justice, which was later renamed to Operation Enduring Freedom, and most notably, the Axis of Evil. Bush did a lot of lying and fear-mongering in his speeches. He talked a lot about freedom, but freedom for him meant launching preventative wars at any time, in any place, on innocent civilians, and then saying that this war was a good thing because it was killing terrorists. He manufactured a terrorist other, and I'm going to quote Kellner here because I think he explained this really well. The terrorist other does not reside in a specific country with particular military targets and forces, but is part of an invisible network supported by a multiplicity of groups and states. This amorphous terrorist enemy then allows the Crusader for Good to attack any country or group that is supporting terrorism, thus promoting a foundation for the Bush doctrine of preemptive and perennial war. Key words here are that the othered enemy is invisible and amorphous, and that the war is perennial, meaning that it never ends. Bush's othering of Muslims was based on a really harmful binary of good versus evil, human versus less than human, and us versus them. And it's the same binary that President Snow and Dr. Gall drew between the capital and the district. For these war criminals, there was a distinction drawn between a group that is animalistic and a group that is civilized. And like I mentioned before, Bush manufactured the Axis of Evil. In early 2002, he claimed in a speech that Iraq, Iran, and North Korea formed an axis of evil, and that he was prepared to go to war against them indefinitely. This speech was fear-inducing, because he warned of nuclear attacks on the US and used this to justify his preemptive wars. The phrase axis of evil was extremely misleading because not only did it imply that these countries were embarking on a common project of domination, but it also implied that they were all harboring nuclear weapons. Neither of these implications were true. By the way, no weapons of mass destruction were ever found in Iraq. Bush portrayed his preventative wars as wars of peace, and he portrayed his occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan as liberation, liberating Muslim women from the oppressiveness of Islam. If you know anything about Islam, you know that it is one of the religions that offers the most freedoms to women. First of all, what Bush was doing with this axis of evil speech was doublespeak. Second, that's exactly how President Snow positioned his continued oppression and exploitation of the districts with the Treaty of Treason and the slogans about peace. I'd also like to discuss the role of media and entertainment post 9/11 because it seems to have played a really huge inspirational role for the Hunger Games series. These books are a warning of what happens when the privileged world becomes so desensitized to violence that they consider mass murder to be a form of entertainment. For decades, US media has exploited fear by presenting excessive dramatizations of violence and foreign threats, and it is often the Middle East that is presented as a source of danger to manufacture these threats. Almost all of Hollywood's depictions of Arabs and Persians are negative. Hollywood has had many profitable relationships with US governmental bodies like the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency. Additionally, for films to secure access to military equipment for props or military bases for set locations, authorities must first approve of the script. The films that are supported by these government agencies tend to be politically conservative, very patriotic, and portray the military in a positive light. Bush encouraged the entertainment industry to support his war on terror, and his fear-mongering became a weapon of mass hysteria. It caused US citizens to crave revenge and to look to their government for protection. Sound familiar? I feel like my voice is getting very angry right now, but it's just because this pisses me off so much. The Hunger Games as a televised sporting event were originally designed as punishment for the districts and to whip the capital citizens into a fear-induced hysteria. They soon transformed into something that no capital citizen could look away from, no matter how violent it was, no matter how scared they were, and it transformed into something that they craved, something that they looked forward to each year. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about before we move on from propaganda is something called facilitative communication, and this ties really well into the idea of violence as entertainment. Martin, 1971, defined this type of communication as an activity designed to keep lines open and maintain contacts for when they'll be needed for propaganda. So this includes things like the radio, press releases, books, pamphlets, periodicals, exhibits, films, seminars, and more. All forms of communication leave a mark on the person receiving it. For example, saying hello to someone with your arms crossed and your gaze pointed downwards communicates something entirely different than saying hello to someone with a smile and a wave. Propaganda is effective when it's facilitative, when it opens up these channels of communication. Collins focused on two types of facilitative communication in Sunrise. Obviously, there's the games themselves. The Capitol makes sure that the Hunger Games is burned into our brains, but more specifically, there's the card stacking that Plutarch does, and something else called transfer. So let's start with card stacking. It's like a game of poker being played in real life, where 9 out of 10 players are playing fairly and the 10th player is cheating. They're stacking the deck in their favor so that they always get the winning hand. To quote our good friend Blair, "What kind of idiot gets born on reaping day anyways?" Haymitch replies, "Just playing the hand I was dealt, but you know what they say, unlucky at cards, lucky in love." Ugh. Maybe not. There's a lot of this game imagery happening throughout the novel with this idea that Plutarch is playing into the Capitol's propaganda and Haymitch describing himself as a plaything, and then Wyatt's character entirely. And there's this whole idea that if you do act as the plaything, if you do play into the false narrative, you will get dealt a better hand. You won't get slapped by Drusilla, you'll have more sponsors, and you'll get more screen time, which is really important because facial recognition in a quarter quell with twice as many tributes could be the difference between life and death. All this imagery is mainly present when Plutarch is on screen, for lack of a better term, and that's because he is the one shuffling the deck. He's the poker player that's cheating, and it's kind of unclear whether we're supposed to interpret his cheating as a good or a bad thing, and that's because he is extremely morally gray. On the one hand, he's a hero because he's using his privilege and his resources to further the goals of the Underground Revolution, but on the other hand, he is willing to sacrifice lives and destroy families. Clearly, Plutarch wants to capture my delight so he can broadcast it all over Panem. Look how well the capital treats the tributes, how forgiving they are to their enemies, how superior they are to those district piglets in their sinkholes. I've seen similar clips before of the tributes being treated like pampered pets, being brushed and fed and flattered, lapping it up, playing into the capital propaganda. Maybe it gets them more sponsors, but if they do win, it's not going to get them a parade back home. This quote is from right after the whole birthday cake fiasco and before Hamish knew that Plutarch was actually on his side. We as the readers know that what he is trying to do is a good thing, so it's hard to find fault in his actions because ultimately he was the driving force that allowed Katniss to be able to become the Mockingjay and for the revolution to succeed. None of that would have happened without his card stacking in this book or the card stacking that he does in the Mockingjay propos in the book Mockingjay. But at the same time, it begs the question, how many Mockingjays failed before Katniss succeeded? What are some of the ways that Plutarch stacked the cards in Sunrise? In what ways did he advance the goals of the revolution? And in what ways did he just continue to play into capital propaganda? I find that he does a lot more to maintain the capital's narrative than to tear it down in this book. And his acts of rebellion are mostly unseen, so maybe that's why. And there's two examples. We have him allowing Hamish to have a moment with Ma and Sid to say goodbye. But of course this comes with the caveat that his family will act out their reactions to him being raped over and over again until Sid is literally brought to tears and can't take anymore. And Plutarch doesn't extend this courtesy of the capital to any of the other families, which I think is pretty messed up. Yes, there was a time constraint, but come on, Drusilla was not going to leave without all 4 tributes. She's dumb, but she's not that dumb. And then 2, we get several conversations between him and Hamish about implicit submission, revolution, and playing the long game. These conversations are in private, not televised, obviously because if Plutarch did it in front of other people, he would out himself. He'd lose the game of poker and he'd give up whatever upper hand he had as not only a capital-born man, but also as a Heavensby man. How many times does Plutarch stack the cards to help the capital, though? I watch both fascinated and sickened by the flawless transition from Maisley's drawing to Wyatt's and mine. Not even a hint of Woodbine's shooting or the turmoil that followed. And there's my name, and there's me, and there's Ma gasping, Sid crying, Lenore Dove with her hand clasped over her mouth. That's not what happened, I say. Plutarch is 100% playing into capital propaganda here. Hamish wasn't even reaped, and yet he made it look like his name was pulled from that reaping bowl. At the same time, he is trying to paint Hamish in a positive light to help him be recognized and get sponsors. This is what makes him so morally gray. Now, I could continue talking about all the ways that Plutarch stacks the cards and changes the footage of the Quarter Quell compared to what Katniss and Peeta are seeing in Catching Fire, but several creators have already done this, and I think it'd be interesting to instead talk about how Hamish uses card stacking to forward the Rebel Arena plan. Of course, he doesn't have access to raw footage or cameras, so his card stacking looks quite a bit different. His card stacking is in the way that he acts. He pretends to do one thing while actually having the ulterior motive to do something else, and there's 3 incredible examples of this. One is when he's attacked by the butterfly mutts and he uses the opportunity to find the entrance to the sub-A floor. This is my chance to follow them to their berm. However, I don't jump up. The recent attack has zapped some sense into me. For once in your life, be smart, I think. Do this, but do not jeopardize the arena plan. Why would I possibly be chasing mutt butterflies? Only one answer: retaliation. Then he grabs a branch that has caught on fire and the scene continues. For the benefit of the game makers, I rage at them, swinging my torch around madly, incinerating a half dozen or so when I notice the berm beginning to slide closed. As if in a last-ditch effort, I lunge at the final mutt and succeed in wedging the branch between the lips of the hatch. It clamps shut, crushing the wood, but leaving an 1/8 of an inch opening in the seam. I pretend not to notice and slump down next to the berm. The second example of Haymitch card stacking is when he meets up with Ambert in the arena, and that is just a few pages later after that quote with the butterflies. Wait a minute. Once again, what am I doing? Why has the rascal, after running away from the newcomers, caught sight of Ambert and returned to the edge of the woods? This is different from Lulu. She found me. My behavior seems suspicious, like I've been waiting for him the whole time. I don't think this will matter to the audience, but what are the game makers going to make of it? I told them that I was only out for myself. What could have drawn me back to Ambert? The answer can't be explosives. What would extend my survival? I've got my own food, water, and charcoal tablets and weapons. What can Ambert offer me? The one thing I don't have much of is information. I know who's dead, but who killed them and how? What weapons arm the careers? Have they discovered anything to eat or drink in here that isn't poisonous? Except for Lulu, I've been alone, and she wasn't exactly a wealth of information. Okay then, this rascal wants an update. I think Haymitch does such a good job at presenting a consistent version of himself as the rascal. Like, even Katniss and Peeta fall for it when they watch the recap in Catching Fire. What we can't say for certain, though, is if the game makers fell for it. And then the third example is that somehow Haymitch and Ambert have to discuss their plan without actually giving themselves away. So what does Haymitch do? He takes Ambert on a tour of the area that he's been in. He shows him all of the poisonous plants and the poisonous stream and tells him about the bunny. But what he's actually doing is just walking to the berm. And Ambert is a really smart kid for picking up on this so quickly and for being able to follow along. And then he offers a sunflower from District 9 to Haymitch, saying that they'd want him to wear it, which of course they would, but really what he's doing is giving Haymitch a bomb. Honestly, Haymitch's version of card stacking connects really well to the quote from George Orwell on the first page. All propaganda is lies, even when one is telling the truth. I don't think this matters so long as one knows what one is doing and why. Haymitch had created his own form of propaganda. He was acting, pretending, persuading the game makers that he's trying to survive, and yet he's still telling the truth. He is retaliating, just not in the way that the game makers will think. They'll think he's retaliating against their mutts, when really he's retaliating against the Hunger Games themselves. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Haymitch is lying or telling the truth because he knows what he's doing and he has a strong moral argument for why he's doing this. So that's card stacking, and now we are left with transfer, which can be one of the most subtle and arguably one of the most dangerous forms of propaganda. Transfer is a form of communication that is seen and engaged in every day. It's the associations made between symbols, concepts, and events. It's a projection of an idea, a value, an entity, an object onto another thing. Only certain people can card stack, but everyone is involved in transfer, whether they're aware of it or not. In the Scholastic interview, Collins gave the example of the waving flag of Panem. When the flag is seen, it's associated with the Treaty of Treason and with Snow's power as president. It's a reminder of Gaul's eternal war. The flag is a pretty obvious form of transfer, I'd say, because it's so in your face. It's there all the time and it is unavoidable. Some other examples are the posters of Snow, the slogans, the military films that are shown at every reaping, the Mighty Gem of Panem anthem. These things are ubiquitous. You cannot escape them. They're facilitative because they maintain really well the lines of communication for propaganda. This kind of facilitative transfer is used at every single reaping in every single district during every single Hunger Games and is everywhere in the capital. The screens project images of the capital's power, armies of marching peacekeepers, airborne fleets of hovercraft, tanks parading through the wide avenues of the capital up to the presidential mansion. Everything is clean and expensive and deadly. But these obvious forms of transfer get to a point where seeing them becomes something that is done subconsciously. It's something that you tune out. When you see it, your eyes, I guess, metaphorically glaze over. It becomes something that you engage in without really thinking too deeply about it. An excellent example of this is in Catching Fire when Katniss meets Bonnie and Twill in the woods, and they tell her that the footage of District 13 that is shown every year is the same footage that's used over and over again. Katniss sees this every year and she doesn't question it. She falls for what this footage is trying to persuade her of and what it's trying to communicate. So if Katniss, a district girl who hates the Capitol, doesn't pick up on this, then what does it look like for the Capitol citizens whose eyes are glazed over? It's probably 10 times worse. And this is where those dangerous, more subtle forms of transfer come into play. If you're tuning out the most obvious things, you're going to have a very difficult time noticing the smaller things that aren't so loud and in your face all the time. These things include the use of color and design in fashion, dinner parties with friends, school field trips, architecture, the kind of car you drive, the kind of car you see other people driving. So I mentioned color and design and fashion. When Drusilla is first introduced, her outfit communicates a very specific message. It's quarter quell themed, a mix of military and sassy. The previous year, Haymitch mentions that she had tiny buzzsaw blades all around her face. All of her outfits, but especially the quarter quell one, are intended to communicate the Capitol's military domination over the districts. People in the districts are gonna look at this and they're gonna clock it right away, most likely. But for people in the Capitol, they're gonna look at this and go, hey, that's just what's trendy, and it looks good. One thing I didn't notice until I reread the book. Yes, I reread the book. I've actually read it 3 times. No, I am not okay. And I think it speaks volumes to how subtle transfer can be, is the use of color in Capitol personnel uniforms and also in the white marble architecture of the Capitol and the Heavensby home. I can't even count how many times Haymitch mentions that the Peacekeeper uniforms are white. And when I started to notice it, it really got on my nerves. And I was just shocked that I did not pick up on this the first time I read it. On pages 100 and 101, Haymitch mentioned the trainers fitted in white jumpsuits and the game makers draped in snowy gowns. This use of color speaks to your subconscious. White communicates innocence and purity, and not only is this transfer, but it's also doublespeak because war keepers, they're not pure or innocent. And all of this white in the Capitol is contrasted with the vibrant colors that the tributes are outfitted in. You look at the Peacekeepers all in white and you subconsciously think organization, uniformity, and control. Then you look at the tributes in colors and you think chaos, confusion, disorder, and whatever other meanings each color is typically associated with. Like the snot green from District 1, you think, ew, that's gross. Notably, District 2 is given purple outfits. Purple is associated with royalty, loyalty, and power, which makes sense for the district that is most closely aligned with the Capitol. The head game maker, Faustina Gripper, a short, ample woman with close-cropped metallic silver and gold curls, is distinguished by the purple fur collar on her snowy robe. So you see her, one of the most powerful people in Panem, and you see her wearing purple. And then you look at District 2. Your subconscious is gonna go, oh, they're loyal to Faustina, and Faustina is loyal to the Capitol, so therefore District 2 is loyal to the Capitol. Another interesting thing to note that I think kind of fits into fashion is that for male tributes, their facial hair is removed during their prep. They're made to look younger and less scary this way. The reason for this is because it helps maintain the narrative that district children are dangerous and deceptive. Clean-shaven faces communicate innocence, but when paired with all of the horrific things that they're forced to do in the arena, it communicates the exact opposite. As I talked about in my second video in this series, this image of deceptive innocence plays right into Snow's Hobbesian worldview and perception of humanity. If even the most innocent among us can turn into beasts, what does that say about humanity? It says that humanity needs to be controlled. Who's gonna control it? Apparently Snow, who thinks that he is going to be the savior of humanity. Then there's the transfer in the dinner parties that Drusilla and Effie and Vitus like to host. Let me just rapid fire through these and what they all say about these parties. Drusilla prides herself on directing a seamless reaping in 12, and she said, I have no idea how I just did that. She pulls a pack of cigarettes from her boot and lights up, exhaling the smoke through her nose like it's a chimney. Well, it's a great story for dinner parties. She is going to do some facilitative communicating at these parties, and what is she going to tell people? Not the truth, that's for sure. She'll tell people that she successfully covered up a riot even though no riot took place. She'll perpetuate the false narrative that the districts are barbaric. After Haymitch is given his prep by his team, Vitus runs off because he promised his mother he'd help her decorate for her Hunger Games party tonight. All of those decorations are going to communicate something. What the fuck kind of decorations do they have? That is a terrifying thought. And Effie, the master party planner, what kinds of conversations are taking place at her events? What narratives are being told? I also mentioned school field trips. When Haymitch first arrives in the capital, he and his fellow tributes are being transported in a windowless van. And when they're released from the van, they see a group of young school children, all in matching uniforms, supposedly on a school field trip. They point and they stare at the tributes who are being hauled off in chains like animals. I guarantee you that these children's families don't drive them around in windowless vans. I guarantee you that these children's families' cars have windows and that they are treated like human beings. Everything communicates something. There's so much that can be said about propaganda, so much that can be said about the propaganda in this book, but if I don't stop talking now, this video will be 10 hours. So I'm going to end this section off with a quote from Plutarch, and then we'll move on to human reasoning, because understanding this will help to explain why people implicitly submit and fall for propaganda. It's all connected. From the capital's perspective, the games are the best propaganda we have. You tributes, you're our stars. You carry it out, but only if we control the narrative. Don't let us. Plutarch grasps my shoulders and gives me a little shake. No more implicit submission from you, Haymitch Abernathy. Below that water tank sky high, the entire country needs you to. Okay, human reasoning time. Why do humans think the way that they do? I'm going to compare and analyze Lenore Dove and Haymitch's ways of thinking in this because they're quite opposing. And we're going to turn to David Hume again for some potential answers. But more specifically, I'm going to use essay number 4 in his 1748 collection titled An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And the essay is titled Skeptical Doubts Concerning the Operations of the Understanding. And this is where the following quote comes from. That the sun will not rise tomorrow is no less intelligible a proposition and implies no more contradiction than the affirmation that it will rise. These two propositions, that the sun will rise and that the sun will not rise, are both probable. Just because the sun has risen every day for 1,000,000 years does not automatically mean that it will rise tomorrow. That the sun will rise is not a fact, it's merely a pattern, and therefore the opposite is still possible. So why is it that we are all 100% certain that the sun will rise tomorrow? A simple way of explaining this is through inductive and deductive reasoning. Deductive is top-down logic. Think of logic like an upside-down triangle. Why did that take me so long to make? Think of logic like an upside-down triangle, where the top represents general statements and the bottom represents specific statements. For example, the statement, all human beings need food to survive, is a general one. I am a human being and therefore I need food to survive is a specific statement, working your way from the general premise to the specific conclusion. Inductive reasoning is basically the complete opposite. It's a bottom-up logic. For example, the statement, I am a human being who hates peanut butter, is a specific conclusion. My human friend Sally also hates peanut butter, therefore all humans hate peanut butter is the general premise. But if I actually argued this, it would be faulty reasoning because the general premise is based on only 2 people. I don't know, nor have I spoken to all 8 billion people on this planet to be able to say with any certainty that we all hate peanut butter. Also, yes, I actually do hate peanut butter. It is genuinely the most disgusting food ever. Faulty bottom-up logic is the type of reasoning that we see within Haymitch's brain. The sun is guaranteed to rise tomorrow morning. The Hunger Games are guaranteed to happen every year. He thinks that these 2 propositions are the be-all and end-all. He's making assumptions and jumping to conclusions without considering what has come before and what can possibly come after. His mind is only in the now. Lenore Dove, on the other hand, uses top-down logic to reason out problems. The Hunger Games have not always existed, therefore they will not always exist. The way we form propositions in our minds can be broken down even further, and Hume argued that all objects of human reason can be divided into 2 kinds. First, there's relations of ideas, also known as demonstrative reasoning. This kind includes the sciences, so like geometry and algebra, and things that are demonstratively certain are things like 1 + 1 = 2. These operations of thought do not depend on what actually exists in the universe. You cannot find 1 + 1 = 2 in the universe, but we're certain that this is the truth. And denial of these truths leads to a contradiction. 1 + 1 = 3 is a contradiction to 1 + 1 = 2. This type of reasoning is similar to how Hamish thinks. For him, it was a scientific truth that there would always be a reaping on his birthday, that the games would continue indefinitely. But we can't use this type of logic to predict what might happen in the future. A scientific discovery may yet be made that 1 + 1 does in fact equal 3. And then the second kind are matters of fact, also known as moral reasoning. Just because something is deemed fact does not mean that the opposite is not possible. If you can conceive the opposite of a fact in your mind, then it is possible. Where demonstrative reasoning argues that opposites are contradictory, moral reasoning does not. For a moral reasoner, opposites are not contradictory, and we should try to prove that 1 + 1 = 2 is false. After all, what evidence do we actually have to say that 1 + 1 = 2, other than our individual senses and our memory? It is a little hard to conceive that 1 + 1 might not actually equal 2. But there was a time when humans did think that the sun rotated around the Earth. Their eyesight and ability to sense heat would have told them that the sun makes arcs around the sky. At its lowest point, it is cold. At its highest point, it is hot. And the Earth does not move while the sun makes this arc across the sky. Their senses told them that the sun rotates and that the Earth remains static. And their memory would have told them that this had always been the case. The sun always moves and the Earth never does. This was believed until it was demonstrated that this is false. It's the Earth that rotates around the sun. But again, even this might be proven false. Hume encouraged us to find faults in facts and said that the bane of all reasoning and free thought was implicit faith in facts. Hamish had implicit faith that the Hunger Games were a fact. Lenore Dove did not. So the words that Hume uses are a little bit confusing, so I'd like to make this a little simpler for my sake, but also your sake. And I know I could just use inductive and deductive reasoning, but if I'm being completely honest, I keep getting them mixed up. It's like left and right. Like, I am so bad at giving directions because I will tell you to go left, but I will point right. And I don't want to accidentally say one when I actually mean the other. So instead I've come up with my own terms. I also just like coming up with my own terms. I think it's really fun. So from here on out, I'm going to refer to Lenore Dove's way of thinking as curious questioning and to Hamish's as implicit acceptance. Let's look at Lenore Dove's curious questioning first. Why is it that she was able to conceive of a world without the Hunger Games? Like I said before, we typically base our logic on our five senses and on our memory, on cause and effect relationships. But it is possible to go beyond this. To explain this, Hume used the example of a man on a deserted island who finds a watch and then concludes that the reason the watch is here is because there used to be another man on the island. However, there are possible explanations that do not include other people being on the island. Maybe the watch washed ashore. Maybe it fell from the sky. Maybe a bird brought it and thought it would make good nesting material. We tend to rely on cause and effect relations because they're based on things that we've experienced, and we trust our experiences to be true. Fire is hot because one time I stuck my hand in a fire and I got burned. But if you'd never seen a fire, would you believe me if I told you that it was hot? After all, you've never experienced it, and so what if I'm wrong and fire is actually cold? When our logic is governed by our experiences, we struggle to make inferences about the world. If you've never experienced a fire, and you only base your knowledge on your experiences, then you'd never be able to conceive that fire can burn. And this is how all facts, including 1 + 1 = 2, are created. They're based on empirical observation, not on theoretical deduction. But even theoretical deduction at the end of the day is also based on experience. If you rely on experience to form your logic, then you're similar to Hamish. You're engaging in implicit acceptance. Why? Because it's simple, it's easy, there seems to be an answer, and we humans, we like answers. Let me put it to you this way. If your partner of 10 years suddenly breaks up with you with no explanation, you're going to seek closure. You're going to want to know why it is that they ended this long-term committed relationship. You're going to seek closure. You're going to ask them for the exact reasons because getting a straight answer is easier than making inferences without the guidance of their answers. It's easier to beg for closure than to let go, not knowing why they left you. If you sit with the uncomfortability of not having answers, you open yourself up to endless possibilities, but that can be scary in most situations, and so we tend to avoid it. And even if you got an answer from this person who broke up with you, new questions are going to arise. They said it was because you're no longer compatible. Okay, why are you no longer compatible? They said it was because they love peanut butter and you hate it. Why are they basing compatibility on peanut butter? You see, the questions, they can go on and on. What's the foundation for facts? Cause and effect. What's the foundation for cause and effect? Experience. What's the foundation for experience? Similarity between objects. What's the foundation for similarity between objects? Uniformity in experiments. But here's the thing. There's always the possibility that an outlier crops up in an experiment. And if there's an outlier, then we cannot rely on those other experiments, even if they all shared the exact same results. And Lenore Dove presents Hamish with a pretty big outlier. So Hamish says, the reaping's going to happen no matter what, I believe, sure as the sun will rise tomorrow. And Lenore Dove replies, well, there's no proof that will happen. You can't count on things happening tomorrow just because they happened in the past. It's faulty logic. You have no way of knowing that. I mean, the reaping didn't even exist until 50 years ago. Give me one good reason why it should keep happening just because it's your birthday. That is a pretty strong outlier. Humans have existed for thousands of years, and yet the Hunger Games have only been around for 50. Lenore Dove called Hamish's logic faulty, and his retort was that this kind of logic is how people plan their lives. And he's right. Since Hamish was born, his life had always been planned around the Hunger Games, and so he will continue to plan his life around the Hunger Games. He has to plan his life around the reaping, otherwise he will feed his nightmares, and to keep his sanity and avoid panic, he has to continue thinking this way. This makes the example with the breakup seem trivial, but it's the same idea. There's an uncomfortability in not having all of the answers. And if Hamish allowed himself to hope that the future might be different, he would have driven himself to panic. He's very similar to Katniss in this way. They were both just trying to survive and get through each day. Neither of them could conceive of a revolution until they could because of new experiences. When Hamish arrives in the capital, he has a new experience that changes the way that he thinks about the Hunger Games. He begins to see them as finite, as something that is not inevitable. He can now conceive of a way to stop them from happening. But this is still implicit acceptance. He can conceive of a different future, not because he's able to think outside the box, but because he has now had a different cause and effect relationship that he can base his logic on. Lenore Dove, on the other hand, can think outside the box and doesn't rely on her experiences. She's never experienced a world without a Hunger Games, and yet she can still picture it. Her people were great travelers once, going from district to district to perform their music. Tam Amber remembers it, as he was about my age when the war ended and the peacekeepers rounded up the covey, killing all the adults and confining the kids to our district. Nothing Lenore Dove loves better than those stories of the old days. So Lenore Dove heard these stories from her uncle, and then Hamish heard them from Lenore Dove. They both had access to these stories from a world without the games, but thinking this way for Hamish just wasn't practical. He couldn't afford to think this way, and unfortunately, we never really get insight into why they both think so differently, despite both knowing that the games have not always existed. My best guess is that it's because after Hamish's father died, he became the man of the house. He became a caretaker and provided his family with income and had to take care of Sid. And Lenore Dove just didn't have the same expectations riding on her, and so she could afford to ask difficult questions and to think much more curiously. I'm not sure what I would have done yesterday if the roles had been reversed. I'd have wanted to follow Lenore Dove, maybe stowed away on the train and helped her escape or died trying, or at least burn the peacekeepers' base to the ground. But in reality, whatever plans I might have concocted would have been kept in check by my thought of Ma and Sid trying to get by without me. I'd probably have just gone quietly insane. It's different for her. No one depends on Lenore Dove for their livelihood. She can run as wild as the wind. Haymitch's failure to break the arena is again a new experience that starts to guide his logic. After Lenore Dove is killed, Haymitch's implicit acceptance of the games and their inevitability cause him to spiral into a really deep depression. He accepts that they'll continue forever and ever, and that he'll always be Snow's slave. And we get that absolutely devastating segment at the end of the book when Lenore Dove's name poem, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, haunts him day in and day out. And reading this brought me back to a quote from much earlier in the book. "She's smart as a whip. Did you know ravens use logic to solve things?" Not only is Haymitch being haunted by Snow's cruelty, but also by all the what-ifs. He's being haunted by Lenore Dove's way of thinking. From experience, he came to realize that curious questioning was dangerous. To think, what if the plot to break the arena worked? What if the Hunger Games ended? Is dangerous and got people killed. And this haunting forced him deeper and deeper into his implicit acceptance and submission. Those what-ifs became an impossibility. He couldn't conceive of a different outcome, at least not until he experienced it with Katniss. I hope that I have explained this section well enough. It is quite confusing because it's far more philosophical than it is political, and my strong suit is not philosophy. I had debated not even including it, but I do still think it's important to know the basics so that we can understand why Haymitch implicitly submits and why Lenore Dove doesn't. And with that, let's move on to implicit submission. Final section, here we go. Quick reminder of what implicit submission is. It's when people resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. And a person might never outwardly express their consent or dissent through words, but by abiding by the laws of a government and following along with whatever the rulers want, this person is implicitly submitting. It's the actions or sometimes the inactions here that matter rather than what a person's words are. And to explain what implicit submission is, I'm gonna break this section down into 3 subcategories. So first, we're gonna look at implicit submission on an individual level with Haymitch, and then on a national level with Capital Citizens, and finally on a district level with the Hunger Games. And it's really only at the district level where we see a refusal to implicitly submit, so that will make for some really good contrast between these categories so that we get a more well-rounded picture of what this concept is. Let's start with the individual level with Haymitch. You might think that it isn't until the very end of the book where we see him implicitly submit, but we can actually see it really early on. And while it's true that his implicit submission does become far more severe at the end of the book, it does exist right from the get-go in chapter 1. First, like I mentioned earlier, although Haymitch hates the Capitol and what they stand for, he never speaks out against it and he never expresses his dissent out loud. He keeps his head down, he gets his work done, he takes care of his family, and he survives each day because doing anything else would drive him insane. The second is in the way Haymitch has fallen for Capitol propaganda about District 12, but more specifically about the Abernathys being troublemaking rebels. Page 5. Rumors spread after my father's death. Rumors that the fire had not been an accident. Some say he died sabotaging the mine, others that his crew was targeted by the Capitol bosses for being a pack of troublemakers. So it could be my kin's the problem. Haymitch believes that standing up against the Capitol makes you a troublemaker, and he doesn't blame the Capitol for his dad's death, he blames his own bloodline. And that's precisely the narrative that the Capitol wants the districts to believe about themselves. And then on page 9, when he's describing to us the rebellious lyrics in Lenore Dove's songs, he says, "Why go asking for trouble?" Haymitch believes that speaking out is troublemaking, and he continues to refer to himself as a troublemaker throughout the entire novel. Furthermore, he does seem to believe that the districts simply have no power, and so to do anything other than to submit is useless. On page 11, he says, "Well, it's a fine idea, thinking about a world with no reaping. I don't really see it happening. The Capitol has all the power, and that's that." You heard him, that's that. There's no other options. Or so he's convinced himself. And then we get that tragic quote on page 18, where he's talking about the reaping. "In 2 years, Sid will be there. I wonder whether it'll be me or Ma who sits him down beforehand and explains about his role in the reaping. how he has to look nice and keep his mouth shut and not cause any trouble. Even if the unthinkable happens and his name gets drawn, he's got to suck it up, put on the bravest face he can muster, and climb onto that stage, because resistance is not an option. If resistance is not an option, then what is? Well, the opposite, submission. What Haymitch fails to recognize in the early pages of the book comes to recognize in the middle of the book and then fails to recognize again at the end is that if you can cause trouble, you have power. You have force on your side. The first time we see him start to question his implicit submission is during the reaping. There's of course the now iconic line, "They will not use my tears for their entertainment," but then the very next page is when we actually start to see him reject his implicit submission and start to employ some of Lenore Dove's curious questioning. "I'm panicked by the sight of a District 12 peacekeeper restraining Lenore Dove. Why didn't I step in sooner? Why did I wait until I had no choice but to defy that soldier? Was I feeling afraid, confused, or just powerless in the face of those white uniforms?" And this questioning of his behavior seems to lead to his regret of his implicit submission. And ultimately, I think this regret is what leads to him agreeing to Plutarch's plan to break the arena so quickly. He doesn't want to die submissive. He wants to go out the way Woodbine did. He wants to go out with a statement and a denouncement of the Capitol. So that's chapter 3, and then by chapter 6, Haymitch is a changed boy. Some of the big screens over the crowd have gone to the waving flag, but a handful of others still display the parade route. I catch sight of myself on one. Luella looks peaceful, like she's asleep in my arms. If this is still being recorded and possibly aired, at least in the Capitol, maybe it does make a difference if I resist as best I can. Maybe this is where I paint my own poster. Spin this, Plutarch. It does take Haymitch a while to fully reject his submission. He still does find himself submitting until he's in the arena, and I just love that he played the Capitol game so well by making it seem like he was submitting when really he was trying to destroy their arena. He was out there painting posters. But during training, there's an almost incident that leaves him curiously questioning his behavior, and he does this with the help of Plutarch. So Haymitch realized at the knife-throwing station that many of the tributes were armed and that they outnumbered the peacekeepers, and he looks over to Regina and she seems to be having the same thoughts. They're both considering an attack, but they don't act on it. Plutarch sees their hesitation and he asks, "Why didn't you?" And then we get this incredibly contextualizing conversation about implicit submission. I still don't think the fear they inspire justifies this arrangement we've all entered into. Do you? We stare at him. He's not taunting or mocking us. He's genuinely asking, "Why do you agree to it? Why do I, for that matter? Why have people always agreed to it?" When we don't respond, he shrugs. Well, it's something to think about. And this makes for a really good segue into the Capitol's implicit submission. Why do they submit? And is it different to why Haymitch submits? Haymitch submits out of fear and a sense of powerlessness and a belief that he is a troublemaker. And while these sentiments do translate into the Capitol citizens, for example, the fear of being turned into an AVOX, I think there's two things that aren't necessarily present in the districts, and those are habit and cognitive dissonance. So let's start with habit, and we can again look to Hume to explain this phenomenon in Essay 5 of the Origin of Government in Essays Moral, Political, and Literary. He explained that humans are naturally compelled to maintain society from necessity and habit. People become accustomed to obedience, but why does this happen? Well, we have to look at why political societies are developed in the first place. Hume seemed to have a very Hobbesian worldview, thinking that human nature was perverse, that humans act in selfish and unacceptable ways. The only way to minimize this incurable weakness of human nature, as Hume called it, is to appoint someone who will uphold the ideals of order, equity, and justice while punishing those who are violent and fraudulent. For this political system to work, citizens must be obedient, and for citizens to be obedient, there must be a government in place that is regarded as having superior qualities to the violent nature of man. If you watched my previous video, this is exactly how Snow has set up his presidency, by maintaining this narrative that his control over Panem is what keeps people from returning to their violent nature. He says that he's protecting humanity, right? And as long as people believe this incurable weakness can be improved by their government, it will become habit to them to be obedient and to submit. He said, "The love of dominion is so strong in the breast of man that many not only submit to, but court all the dangers and fatigues and cares of government." This is a more Lockean worldview. It's similar to what Locke said about people willingly letting themselves be devoured by Hobbes's lion of government rather than subjecting themselves to the minor inconveniences in the wild of possibly maybe being bitten by a polecat. Hume is saying that in reality, no government is as perfect as it may seem, but that people love being dominated by someone that they deem superior in all aspects. We want our leaders to be the best of us, do we not? There's a really telling snippet of conversation that happens between Vitus and Effie that shows their habit of obedience and their belief that their current government is superior to the nature of humanity. So Effie says, "Listen everybody, there is something bigger than you and me happening here. We all know the Hunger Games are a sacred ceremony of remembrance for the dark days. A lot of people lost their lives to guarantee peace and prosperity for our nation. This is our chance. No, it is our duty to honor them." On the next page, Vitus tells Effie, "It was really nice of your great aunt to let us borrow everything." And she responds, "Well, she owes us after all the disgrace she brought to the name of Trinket. We'll be recovering from that for years." And Vitus basically goes, "I know what you mean. My grandfather was a rebel sympathizer." So Effie and Vitus's habit of obedience is built on the perception that Snow's presidency brings peace and prosperity and that he is the best of the best. And it is compounded by a sense of deep shame for their ancestors who displayed the worst of the worst in humanity. Neither Effie nor Vitus are inherently evil people, but they don't ever question their submission. They're clueless, and as Hamish puts it, well, she swallowed the capital propaganda hook and took the line and sinker with it. And then the second thing is cognitive dissonance, doublethink, as George Orwell called it, which is the act of holding two conflicting beliefs simultaneously and feeling discomfort because of it. To resolve the discomfort, people will choose the path of least resistance. So for example, let's do another hypothetical dating situation. So you've been with your partner for 10 years and you've always believed that they were loyal and that they would never do anything to hurt you, but then you find out that they've been cheating on you for the last 10 years, your entire relationship. You are someone who thinks that loyalty is the most important thing within a relationship. So if you break up with them, there is no cognitive dissonance. But if you stay with them, you now have to contend with two conflicting beliefs. On the one hand, you thought for so long that they were loyal and wouldn't hurt you, but now you've learned that they have hurt you and that they have been disloyal. To stay with them and to continue believing that they are loyal is to take the path of least resistance and to be cognitively dissonant. The other path means facing the fact that you've wasted a decade with someone who you thought was the one, and that's really difficult on the mind. Although cognitive dissonance isn't really explicitly shown throughout the novels, if you read between the lines, it must be happening a lot for the capital to maintain its power. One of the more obvious examples is the footage from the tribute parade. Luella died in the crash, and everyone in the audience saw it happen, yet the Capitol news coverage presented the opening ceremony as flawless. It didn't cover Luella's death because that would present the Capitol as incompetent and vulnerable. So when Lulu is introduced and Panem sees her at the interviews, there is a certain amount of cognitive dissonance that must take place. The people who saw Luella die now have to contend with two contradictory beliefs. Luella is dead, Luella is alive. Did these people even question Lulu's existence? Or did they go along with what the Capitol wanted them to believe, that the opening ceremonies were flawless, the crash never happened, and no one got hurt? Are Capitol citizens critically examining the media that they are fed when it contradicts with what they've seen with their own two eyes? Snow seemed to be aware of how gullible the Capitol audience was. He knew that the only people who'd question Lulu's existence were Luella's family and close friends. No one outside the drunken audience at the parade even witnessed the accident. People will believe she's Luella, especially since you'll be there by her side coaching her like the good ally you are. A perfect pair in what I am determined to make a perfect quarter quell. Another example is with Drusilla after the reaping in 12. When Haymitch was practicing for his interview, he mentioned that he messed with a peacekeeper during the reaping, and Drusilla freaked out because, quote, "You'll spoil the brilliant work I did covering up the riot." Despite what she saw, a boy running away, getting shot in the back of the head, and his family grieving, she'd convinced herself that what had happened was a riot. And then, of course, there's the fact that all of the events in the arena were distorted, timelines were changed, and alliances were removed in the replay. We don't know for certain what the Capitol audience was shown while the games were actually happening. We don't know if there was a delay in coverage or if the Capitol was dimming the lighting to hide certain actions, like the brief alliance with Silka, Haymitch, and Welly eating chocolates at the tree. But even if the Capitol was able to change these things in real time, there's one thing that could not be changed: awareness of the newcomer alliance before the games even began. There was no coverage delay during the interviews since there was no potential for an uprising in the Capitol audience. So the fact that everyone saw that a non-career alliance was taking place and that ultimately any mention of it was removed from the replay of the games shows us that cognitive dissonance had to have been taking place in the Capitol. Does anyone even question this? Does no one question that the newcomers were edited to be less unified when in reality they were the largest alliance in Hunger Games history at 32 kids strong? Does no one question that the careers were edited to seem smarter when everyone saw Flickerman hound Panache for being stupid? The audience questions nothing, and instead they cheer when they see the recap. Why don't they ask questions? Why aren't they more curious? While it's never explicitly mentioned, one explanation could be a lack of access to books, or more likely an unwillingness to engage in literature, which is encouraged by Snow's distaste for reading. Plutarch is one of the few Capitol citizens who owns a library and who is an active reader to the point where he has memorized large chunks of certain texts. Reading exposes a person to new opinions and perspectives. It builds empathy and it reduces ignorance. Reading could also be the reason why Lenore Dove is a curious questioner while Haymitch is an implicit acceptor. Lenore Dove has been exposed to stories from a time when the games did not exist. Haymitch had not. Lastly, we can look at implicit submission, or rather the refusal to submit from a district level. I'd like to look at this in terms of the actions and words of Lenore Dove, Maisley Donner, and the newcomer alliance. Let's start with Lenore Dove, our queen, who was arrested 3 times for trying to do the right thing, twice at the age of 12 for allegedly engaging in rebellious acts. She set fire to the Panem flag at the reaping for the 46th games. She also rigged Clay Chance's hanging by sawing through the rope in an attempt to save his life. Then, when Haymitch was in the Capitol, Lenore Dove played several banned songs in front of the Justice Building and was arrested again, not because she sang the songs, but because people joined in and this disturbed the peace. She was also, of course, responsible for spray painting the rebel plays on Capitol propaganda in alleyways that were beyond the peacekeepers' radar. She's a queen. And then we have Maisley. Maisley, who never cared if the Capitol was listening, who didn't hesitate to kill a game maker, and who died with her chin up. Maisley, who insulted the Capitol's fashion choices, slapped Drusilla, and made it a point to always eat with perfect manners because no Capitol citizen would paint her as an uncivilized animal. Maisley, who helped every newcomer display their tokens with pride and dignity, rather than learning skills to protect herself in the arena because what mattered to her was not surviving, but making a statement. One of us has to be the worst victor in history, tear up their scripts, tear down their celebrations, set fire to the victor's village, refuse to play their game. The fact that she says this while sitting in a clump of Katniss is so freaking poetic, I love it. This is who Maisley was, someone who kicked off every day by painting a poster. And finally, we have the newcomer alliance. This alliance alone is a massive refusal to submit and something that we had not seen in Hunger Games canon until this book. Non-career alliance before this quarter quell and then again after tended to be pairs from the same district, never more than 2 people working together. and the exception was the third quarter quell, but those circumstances were so unique because the alliance extended beyond the walls and the confines of the arena. I don't know about you guys, but I found the newcomer alliance to be super fascinating and super refreshing because it's not something that we'd seen in the other 4 books. It also speaks to how the non-career districts refused to implicitly submit for 75 years. They had never bought into the idea that winning the Hunger Games was something to aspire to. Sadly, the careers had been brainwashed and had bought into this propaganda, and in many ways, because they were so easy to control, they were the Capitol's biggest victims. But it's not just the alliance that's interesting, it's also in the actions and the words of the individual members that stand out. Ambert, for example, was the driving force. He was the one who convinced the others that they had strength in numbers and in intelligence. Until then, the Capitol had benefited from the careers winning a disproportionate amount of the time. It benefited from the unequal competitive power between career and non-career, and it benefited from the non-career districts believing that they had no chance of becoming victor. Ambert wanted to change these narratives. We don't have to buy into their mind game that somehow they will always defeat us. The message Ambert was putting out here is one that not only applied to the arena but also to the whole of Panem. If the districts banded together, they could bring down the Capitol, and that's exactly how the Capitol ended up falling. Once District 2 was on board with the Mockingjay Revolution, that was the end of Snow's days landing on top. Another example of the Alliance's refusal to implicitly submit is in the way that they had not mimicked the political structure of other career alliances or of Panem itself. The newcomers had no centralized source of power, no leader. The newcomers had no Cato, they had no panache, they had no capital. The structure of their alliance was a decentralized one where everyone was on equal footing and no one had more or less than anyone else. And by virtue of being different, they were unsubmissive. The idea of claiming Panache's sword stained with newcomer blood creeps me out. I'm not his heir, the new leader of the pack, nor do I want to present myself as such. Not once did any newcomer take the position of a leader. Sure, Ambert and Haymitch guided the others and demonstrated leadership skills, but neither of them was like the leader, because there was no leader for the newcomers. And another newcomer who exemplified a refusal to submit was Lulu. Despite being tortured, physically mutilated, having a microphone speaker in her ear, a drug-pumping contraption strapped to her chest, and possibly cameras in her eyes, she refused over and over again in the only way she could, by exposing the Capitol for what they were, murderers. And when she died, Haymitch repeated her message once more. For Lulu, I say the thing she no longer can, murderers. Every newcomer had each other's backs at all times. While in the arena, it's expected that alliances will break up quickly, that kids will turn on other kids and kill each other, but a newcomer never killed another newcomer. They stuck together just as planned. Teamwork really does make the dream work. There's a reason the Capitol allowed little to no communication between the districts. It prevented them from teaming up as allies against their oppressor. At the end of Sunrise, Plutarch tells Haymitch, "You shook up the Capitol, both figuratively and literally, with that earthquake. You were capable of imagining a different future, and maybe it won't be realized today, maybe not in our lifetime, maybe it will take generations. We're all part of a continuum. Does that make it pointless?" Plutarch begs the question, is a revolution pointless if it takes generations and doesn't happen overnight? Is it pointless if all of our effort goes into something that we don't get to see a successful outcome of? And now we get this beautiful full circle moment between all of the books, because where Mockingjay and Ballad ended with questions that were answered in the subsequent book within the series, Sunrise ended with questions that were answered in the original trilogy. The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and Mockingjay confirm that just because a revolution is a long game does not make it pointless. A revolution is like a science experiment. You need the precise people and moments and circumstances for it to come to fruition. You need someone luckier than Haymitch. You need Katniss. You need someone who has contagious empathy. You need Peeta. You need an event that will unite the masses against their oppressor, like Rue's death. Just having an underground network of rebels is not always going to be enough, and therefore you cannot expect a revolution to happen overnight, but this does not mean that it's not worth it to put your everything into revolting. If you've watched up until this point, Thank you so much. And if you're here because of my other 2 videos, thank you for sticking with me and being oh so patient for this 3rd and final video. You guys are awesome and so nerdy, and I freaking love it, and I'm so grateful. If you have any thoughts at all about the topics discussed, I would love to hear them. Don't downplay your intelligence. No thoughts are dumb, and I genuinely love hearing from you guys and trying to see things from new perspectives. It's such a challenge for my own brain, and to me, that is the joy of learning. Don't worry, this will not be the last you hear from me. I will be back with more nerdy Hunger Games content. I have lots of ideas, and of course I will need someone to share them with. I've also been considering doing a series similar to this for Avatar: The Last Airbender and or Legend of Korra, so you can possibly expect to see that sometime in the future. Again, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Bye for now.